The morning sun cast long shadows across the sleek glass entrance of Stanford Medical Center as security officer James Chen sipped his coffee, trying to shake off the remaining drowsiness from his early start. It was just another Tuesday in October 2019, or at least that's what he thought. The crisp autumn air carried the scent of fallen leaves, and students rushed past with their backpacks and coffee cups, hurrying to their morning classes at the nearby university buildings. Chen had been working at this post for nearly 7 years now, and he prided himself on knowing every regular face that passed through these gates. Doctors with their white coats and ID badges swinging from their necks, researchers clutching their laptops, and administration staff with their perfectly pressed clothes, he could almost set his watch by their arrivals. But something about this morning felt different. Maybe it was the unusual quiet that had settled over the normally bustling research wing entrance, or perhaps it was the way the morning light seemed to paint everything in slightly sharper detail. Whatever it was, Chen couldn't shake the feeling that today wouldn't be like any other day. He was right. Just as he was logging the morning security checks into the system, he noticed a figure approaching from the corner of his eye. An elderly woman, probably in her early 80s, was making her way slowly but purposefully toward the research wing entrance. She wore a simple brown sweater that had seen better days, paired with comfortable walking shoes, and carried a worn leather bag that looked like it had traveled the world twice over. Chen straightened up, already anticipating the conversation to come. The research wing was one of the most restricted areas in the entire medical center, requiring multiple levels of security clearance. Even some of the hospital's top doctors needed special permission to enter certain labs. "Good morning, ma'am," Chen called out politely as the woman reached the security desk. "How can I help you today?" The woman looked up at him with clear, intelligent eyes that seemed to carry decades of knowledge behind them. "I need to access the microbiology research department," she stated simply, her voice carrying a quiet authority that caught Chen off guard. "I'm afraid I'll need to see your ID badge and security clearance, ma'am," Chen responded, following standard protocol. He noticed how her hands, though weathered with age, were steady as she began searching through her bag. "Well, that might be a bit of a problem," she said, a slight frown crossing her face. "My old ID expired some time ago, but what I have to share with the research team simply can't wait." Chen felt his heart sink a little. He'd been in this position hundreds of times before, people trying to get into restricted areas without proper clearance, each with their own urgent reason. It never got easier having to turn them away. "I'm very sorry, but I can't allow anyone into the research wing without proper credentials," he explained gently. "It's a matter of security protocol. Perhaps I can direct you to the main hospital reception. They might be able to help you schedule an appointment with someone." The woman shook her head slowly, reaching into her bag again. "Young man, I understand you're doing your job, and you're doing it well. But there's something happening in those labs right now that I can help with. Lives could depend on it." Chen had heard many creative attempts to get past security before, but something in her voice made him pause. There was no desperation, no anger at being denied entry, just a calm certainty that seemed almost out of place. "Ma'am, I really wish I could help, but rules are rules," Chen said, his voice sympathetic but firm. "I'd be risking my job if I let anyone in without proper clearance." As if sensing his unwavering stance, the woman sighed and began to turn away. That's when Chen noticed something odd. A young researcher passing through the lobby had stopped dead in his tracks, staring at their interaction with wide-eyed recognition. The morning light streaming through the glass walls caught dust particles in its beam, creating an almost ethereal atmosphere as more staff members began to gather in the lobby, whispering among themselves. Chen felt the situation shifting, though he couldn't quite understand why. A small crowd was forming now, and Chen could feel the weight of their collective gaze. Some were pointing at the elderly woman, others were frantically typing on their phones. The quiet Tuesday morning had suddenly become the center of something much bigger than a routine security check. The woman seemed almost amused by the growing commotion, though she maintained a dignified composure. She reached once more into her well-worn bag, this time pulling out a yellowed paper that looked like it had been handled countless times over the years. "Perhaps this might help explain things," she said softly, holding out the document with careful hands. Chen took it gently, his eyes widening as he began to read. It was a research paper dated 1986 that had changed the entire field of synthetic antibiotics. But it wasn't just any copy. This one had handwritten notes in the margins, diagrams sketched in familiar fading ink, and a photograph that made Chen's breath catch in his throat. In the photo, a much younger version of the woman standing before him stood proudly in a laboratory, surrounded by equipment and colleagues who were now legendary names in medical research. The caption read, "Dr. Margaret Wu and team make breakthrough in bacterial resistance research." Chen looked up from the paper to find those same intelligent eyes watching him with patient understanding. The morning sun caught the silver in her hair, and for a moment he could see both versions of her at once. The pioneering researcher from the photograph and the humble figure who had almost been turned away from the very institution she had helped shape. The crowd in the lobby had grown larger now, and the whispers had turned into an excited buzz. Chen could hear snippets of conversations. "It's really her. I studied her work in grad school. I can't believe she's here." Standing there, with the morning sun warming his back and the weight of the moment settling around him, Chen realized that sometimes the most extraordinary stories begin with the simplest of misunderstandings. Few people knew the real story of Dr. Margaret Wu's disappearance from the public eye 15 years ago. The newspapers had speculated, colleagues had whispered theories in break rooms, and students still discussed her sudden retirement in university halls. But the truth was far simpler and far more fascinating than anyone had imagined. On her 67th birthday, Dr. Wu had looked around her state-of-the-art laboratory at Stanford, surrounded by eager graduate students and expensive equipment, and realized something was missing. The pure joy of discovery that had driven her since childhood had somehow gotten buried under mountains of paperwork, endless committee meetings, and the constant pressure to publish or perish. That evening she sat in her garden, watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks. Her husband of 40 years, a retired physics professor, found her there, still in her lab coat, deep in thought. "You're thinking of leaving, aren't you?" he had asked, knowing her better than anyone else in the world. She didn't need to answer. Her smile said everything. Within a month, Dr. Wu had transformed their garage into a modest but efficient home laboratory. It wasn't fancy, just a few carefully chosen pieces of equipment, some basic supplies, and her old microscope from graduate school that she'd never had the heart to replace. But it was exactly what she needed. The scientific community was baffled by her choice. Here was a woman who had access to millions of dollars in research funding, who could walk into any laboratory in the world and be welcomed as royalty. Why would she choose to work in a converted garage? But Dr. Wu knew something they didn't. Some of her best ideas had come when she was working alone, late at night, with nothing but her curiosity and basic tools to guide her. It was how she'd made her first breakthrough as a young researcher, working overtime in a poorly funded university lab in the 1970s. Her new daily routine was simple but productive. She would wake up early, tend to her small vegetable garden, applying the same careful observation skills she used in her research, and then spend hours in her garage laboratory. No deadlines, no pressure, no interruptions, just pure science. Her husband would bring her tea and sandwiches, sometimes finding her so absorbed in her work that she hadn't noticed the sun had set. He'd installed better lighting in the garage after finding her squinting at slides in the dim evening light, and built her custom shelving units to hold her growing collection of research notes. The neighbors thought she was just a quiet elderly woman who spent a lot of time in her garage. They'd wave hello when she went for her evening walks, completely unaware that the person tending to her roses had once given keynote speeches at international conferences and had her research papers cited thousands of times. But Dr. Wu wasn't entirely disconnected from the scientific world. She subscribed to major journals, corresponded with a few trusted colleagues under a pen name, and kept meticulous notes of her ongoing research. Her work on bacterial membrane properties continued, driven by pure curiosity rather than the need for recognition or funding. She developed her own unique methods, combining old-school techniques she'd learned in her youth with modern insights. Without the pressure to follow current trends or chase grant money, she could explore unconventional ideas that others might have dismissed as too risky or time-consuming. Her garage laboratory might have looked primitive to modern researchers, but it had everything she needed. She'd arranged her equipment with the same precision she used in her university lab, each item in its perfect place. The walls were covered with handwritten notes and diagrams, creating a paper trail of her thought process that no digital system could replicate. Over the years, she'd made several significant discoveries in her humble workspace, but unlike her previous work, these findings weren't immediately published or presented at conferences. Instead, she carefully documented everything in her leather notebook, the same one she'd used since her postdoc days. The pages were filled with neat handwriting, detailed observations, and occasional coffee stains, a physical record of years of patient research. She knew her approach was unconventional in an age of rapid publication and instant sharing of results. But she also knew that some ideas needed time to mature, like the vegetables in her garden. You couldn't rush good science, just like you couldn't rush a tomato to ripen. Her husband had asked her once if she missed the recognition, the conferences, the excitement of academic life. She had looked up from her microscope, eyes bright with enthusiasm about her latest observation, and simply said, "I have everything I need right here." But lately, something had been troubling her. Through her careful monitoring of scientific literature, she had noticed a pattern emerging in recent bacterial infection cases. Her years of isolated research had given her a unique perspective on the problem, and she recognized something that others might have missed. For weeks, she had debated whether to break her self-imposed isolation. The research community had largely forgotten about her, or remembered her only as a historical figure from their textbooks. Would they even listen to an elderly woman who had spent the last 15 years working in her garage? But as reports of antibiotic-resistant infections increased, she knew she couldn't stay silent. Lives were at stake. She gathered her most important notes, carefully wrapped her latest bacterial cultures in protective packaging, and placed everything in her old leather bag, the same one she used throughout her career. That morning, as she walked towards Stanford Medical Center for the first time in 15 years, she felt a mix of emotions. Anxiety about how she would be received, determination to share her findings, and a touch of amusement at what people might think when they saw her. Her clothes were chosen for comfort rather than appearance, and her hands showed signs of both laboratory work and gardening. She knew she looked nothing like the distinguished professor she had once been. But appearances had never mattered much to her. It was the work that counted, the endless pursuit of understanding how things worked and how to make them better. As she approached the security gate, she straightened her shoulders and lifted her chin. She might not have current credentials or a fancy title anymore, but she carried something far more valuable: decades of careful observation, unconventional thinking, and discoveries that might just help save lives. Inside Stanford Medical Center's research wing, the atmosphere was tense. Dr. Lee Martinez wiped her forehead with her sleeve as she peered into another microscope. This was the 20th sample she'd examined today, and like all the others, it showed the same troubling pattern. The bacteria were multiplying rapidly, completely unaffected by their strongest antibiotics. "Any change?" asked Dr. Thompson, her colleague of 15 years, though she already knew the answer from Martinez's expression. They'd been working together long enough to read each other's body language, and right now, everything about Martinez's posture spelled defeat. "Nothing," Martinez replied, leaning back in her chair. "These bacteria are unlike anything we've seen before. They're not just resistant, they're thriving on what should be killing them." The research lab, usually a place of quiet concentration, now hummed with nervous energy. Teams of scientists moved between workstations with urgent purpose, their conversations hushed but intense. Phones rang constantly with updates from other hospitals dealing with the same crisis. It had started 3 weeks ago with a single case at a small community hospital about 50 miles north. A patient with what seemed like a routine infection wasn't responding to standard treatments. Within days, similar cases appeared at 2 other hospitals in the state. Now, they had over 30 patients fighting these super-resistant infections, and traditional medical approaches were failing. Martinez picked up her coffee cup, only to find it empty again. She'd lost count of how many cups she had today. The wall clock showed 7:30 a.m., marking hour 23 of what was supposed to be a 12-hour shift. But nobody on the team was counting hours anymore. They couldn't afford to. "The culture results from Bay Area General just came in," announced Dr. Chen, their youngest team member, rushing into the lab with a tablet in hand. His usual cheerful demeanor had been replaced by dark circles under his eyes and wrinkled scrubs that suggested he caught a quick nap in his office again. Everyone gathered around as he pulled up the results on the main screen. The graphs told a story none of them wanted to read. The infection was spreading faster than expected, and it was adapting to their strongest treatments at an alarming rate. "Look at this mutation rate," Thompson said, pointing to a particularly concerning chart. "It's almost as if the antibiotics are teaching it to become stronger instead of killing it." Martinez nodded grimly. She'd seen something similar in her research years ago, but never at this scale or speed. The bacteria were demonstrating an ability to adapt that defied everything in their medical textbooks. In the corner of the lab, their wall of fame, photos of the research team's greatest achievements seemed to mock their current helplessness. Years of successful research, breakthrough treatments, and saved lives, yet here they were, watching a microscopic enemy outmaneuver their every attempt to fight it. "We need to think differently," Martinez said, standing up and walking to the whiteboard that covered one wall. It was already filled with equations, molecular diagrams, and crossed-out theories. "We're approaching this the same way we approach every resistant strain, but clearly that's not working." She began drawing a new diagram, her marker squeaking against the board. "What if we're looking at this all wrong? What if the traditional approach to attacking the bacterial membrane is actually making it stronger?" The team gathered around, their exhausted minds trying to follow her thinking. This was why they'd chosen this field, the puzzle-solving, the challenge of outsmarting nature's most adaptable creatures. But right now, nature was winning. Dr. Wu wrote about something like this back in the 80s. Thompson mused, rubbing her tired eyes. Some theory about bacterial adaptation being more complex than we thought. But nobody could replicate her results with the technology we had then. "Dr. Wu?" Chen asked, looking up from his tablet. Like many younger researchers, he knew the name primarily from textbooks and citation lists. "Margaret Wu," Thompson explained, walking over to their reference shelf and pulling out a worn journal. She was brilliant, way ahead of her time. Had some revolutionary ideas about how bacteria develop resistance. But she disappeared from the field about 15 years ago. Nobody really knows why. Martinez took the journal, flipping through its yellowed pages with careful fingers. The formulas and diagrams might look old-fashioned to their younger colleagues, but the underlying principles were sound. In fact, looking at them now with fresh eyes and decades of new research to build on, they seemed almost prophetic. "We could really use her insight right now," Martinez sighed, placing the journal on her desk. Her understanding of bacterial membrane properties was unmatched. She saw patterns nobody else could see. The lab fell quiet except for the steady hum of equipment. Through the windows, they could see the morning sun beginning to paint the sky in soft pinks and oranges. Another night had passed without a breakthrough, and somewhere in the hospital above them, more patients were fighting for their lives against an enemy they couldn't see. A knock on the lab door broke the silence. A security guard poked his head in, looking somewhat flustered. "Dr. Martinez? There's someone here to see you. Says it's about the bacterial infection cases." Martinez shook her head. They'd already been approached by dozens of well-meaning people offering suggestions, from alternative medicine practitioners to conspiracy theorists. They didn't have time for more distractions. "We're in the middle of critical research," she started to say, but the guard cut her off, something he'd never done before. "Ma'am, I really think you want to see this person," he insisted, his voice carrying an unusual note of urgency. "She's just arrived, and she has some papers you might want to look at." Little did Martinez know that the solution to their crisis was standing just outside the lab door, in the form of an elderly woman carrying a worn leather bag full of research notes that could change everything. The morning bustle at Stanford Medical Center's lobby had reached its usual peak when Dr. Robert Chang walked through the automatic doors, his mind preoccupied with the day's upcoming research meetings. He'd been up late reviewing patient files, and his coffee hadn't quite kicked in yet. The paper cup in his hand was still too hot to drink, steam rising in thin wisps that disappeared in the air-conditioned atmosphere. 20 years of walking through these doors had made the journey almost automatic. Turn right at the information desk, scan his badge at the security checkpoint, nod hello to whoever was on duty, then straight to the research wing. He'd done it so many times he could probably manage it blindfolded. But today was different. Today, something made him stop mid-stride, his coffee forgotten in his hand. There, at the security desk, stood an elderly woman in a brown sweater. Under normal circumstances, he wouldn't have given her a second glance. But something about her stance, the way she held herself even while being turned away by security, triggered a memory buried deep in his mind. He found himself transported back to a lecture hall in 1999. It was his first year of graduate school, and he'd been running late to a guest lecture. He'd slipped into the back row, expecting another dry presentation on molecular biology. Instead, he'd encountered something that would change the course of his career. The speaker that day had been Dr. Margaret Wu. She hadn't used fancy PowerPoint presentations or sleek animations. Instead, she'd drawn diagrams by hand on the chalkboard, explaining complex concepts with such clarity and enthusiasm that even the students dozing in the back row had sat up and taken notice. Chang remembered how she'd stayed after the lecture, patiently answering questions from a long line of students. He'd been the last one, nervous but determined to ask about a theory he'd been working on. Instead of dismissing him, she'd sat down, pulled out her notebook, and spent 45 minutes discussing his ideas. Sometimes the best discoveries come from the questions nobody else thinks to ask, she'd told him, her eyes twinkling with genuine interest in his work. Those words had become his guiding principle throughout his research career. Now, 20 years later, he stood frozen in the lobby, that same voice floating across the space. It was older, perhaps a bit softer, but unmistakable. The coffee cup slipped from his fingers, hitting the floor with a splash that drew several irritated looks from nearby staff members. But Chang didn't notice the spreading puddle of coffee around his feet. His eyes were fixed on the security desk, his mind racing to reconcile the elegant professor from his memories with the modest figure being turned away by the guard. Without conscious thought, he found himself moving forward. The security guard, Chen, according to his name tag, was doing his job, explaining protocol with professional courtesy. But Chang could see the larger picture unfolding, could sense the magnitude of what was about to be lost if Dr. Wu walked away from those doors. Other people in the lobby had begun to notice something was happening. A small crowd was forming, drawn by Chang's obvious distress and the quiet dignity of the elderly woman. Some were pulling out their phones, perhaps recognizing her from old research papers or conference photographs. Dr. Wu? Chang's voice came out as barely more than a whisper, but it carried across the suddenly quiet lobby. She turned, and in that moment, he saw both versions of her. The distinguished professor who had inspired his career and the humble figure who now stood before him. A flicker of recognition crossed her face. "Ah," she said, studying him with those same keen eyes he remembered. "You were the young man with the interesting questions about bacterial membrane permeability. Back row, left side of the lecture hall, if I remember correctly." Chang felt tears welling up in his eyes. After all these years, after thousands of students and countless lectures, she remembered not just him but where he'd sat in that lecture hall. It was so characteristic of her attention to detail, her genuine interest in every student she encountered. The security guard looked between them, confusion evident on his face. The crowd in the lobby had grown larger, and whispers were spreading like ripples in a pond. "That's really her." "The Dr. Wu. I thought she'd retired years ago." "Dr. Wu," Chang said, louder now, his voice carrying his years of respect and gratitude. "I'm now heading the molecular biology department here. Your work on bacterial resistance, it changed everything. We still use your methods, your theories. They're more relevant now than ever." She smiled, reaching into her worn leather bag. "Then perhaps you'll be interested in what I've been working on these past 15 years. She pulled out a notebook, its pages dense with careful handwriting and detailed diagrams. "I believe I might have something that could help with your current crisis." The lobby had fallen completely silent. Even the usual hospital announcements over the PA system seemed muted, as if the building itself was holding its breath. Security Officer Chen looked down at the ID badge requirements on his desk, then back at the remarkable scene unfolding before him. Chang stepped forward, gently taking the notebook from her hands. As he flipped through the pages, his eyes widened. The work was brilliant, combining classical approaches with innovative thinking that could only come from decades of uninterrupted, pure research. Officer Chen, he said, his voice thick with emotion, this woman is not just a visitor. She's one of the most brilliant minds in modern medicine. Her work saved countless lives, and I believe she's here to do it again. The morning sun streaming through the lobby windows seemed to brighten, casting a warm glow over the scene. In that light, everyone could see what Chang had recognized, not just an elderly woman in a worn sweater, but a brilliant scientist whose passion for discovery had never dimmed. The morning sun painted golden squares on the lobby floor as more people gathered around the security desk. The usual rush of hospital staff had slowed to a curious crawl, with doctors and nurses pausing in their tracks, drawn by the growing excitement. Even patients and visitors could sense something extraordinary was happening. Dr. Wu stood calmly at the center of it all, her weathered hands still holding her leather bag close. She watched with quiet amusement as Dr. Chang frantically called the research department, his words tumbling out in excited bursts. The security guard, Officer Chen, had moved from his usual spot behind the desk to stand beside her, as if he'd somehow become her unofficial protector. The paper, Dr. Wu said softly, reaching into her bag once more. I think this might help clear things up. She pulled out a document that had clearly been handled countless times over the years. The corners were soft from use, and the pages had that particular yellow tinge that only comes with decades of careful preservation. As she unfolded it, several people gasped. It was a copy of her groundbreaking 1986 paper on synthetic antibiotics, but not just any copy. This was her personal version, filled with handwritten notes that wrapped around the printed text like vines, creating a roadmap of her thought process. I kept this copy all these years, she explained, her fingers tracing the faded ink of her own handwriting. Every time I had a new idea, I'd add it here. Sometimes the margins tell more of the story than the paper itself. Dr. Chung leaned in, his eyes widening as he scanned the notes. These annotations, they're revolutionary. You've been developing these theories all along, haven't you? Even after you left the university? Dr. Wu nodded, a small smile playing at the corners of her mouth. Science doesn't stop just because you leave the laboratory. Sometimes it's quite the opposite. More staff members were arriving now, some carrying tablets displaying Dr. Wu's old research papers, others clutching textbooks where her work was cited. A young intern held up her phone, showing a webpage about Dr. Wu's contributions to medical science. The page included a photograph from 1986, showing a younger Dr. Wu standing proudly in front of her laboratory team. Officer Chen looked between the photograph and the woman standing before him, recognition finally dawning in his eyes. You're really her, he said softly. Your picture, it's in the hall of distinguished researchers. I walk past it every day. Dr. Wu chuckled. Yes, though I must say they chose a rather formal photograph for that one. I'd always preferred the ones taken in the lab, when we were actually working. The hospital's head of security had arrived by now, alerted by the unusual gathering in the lobby. He took one look at the situation and immediately began the process of issuing Dr. Wu a temporary security badge. Sometimes rules needed to bend in the face of extraordinary circumstances. As they waited for the badge to be processed, Dr. Wu continued to share her paper with those gathered around. Her eyes lit up as she explained the complex theories in simple terms that everyone could understand. It was this gift, making the complicated seem clear, that had made her such a beloved teacher. You see, she said, pointing to a particularly dense section of notes, bacteria aren't our enemies. They're just trying to survive, like any other living thing. Once you understand their perspective, you can start to work with their natural processes instead of against them. A door opened somewhere above them, and Dr. Lee Martinez from the research team came hurrying down the stairs. She'd been summoned by Dr. Chang's urgent call and had practically run from the laboratory. She stopped short at the sight of Dr. Wu, her professional composure momentarily cracking. Dr. Wu, she breathed, we were just talking about your work upstairs. We've been trying to understand. She trailed off, her eyes fixed on the annotated paper. Dr. Wu smiled warmly. I hear you've been having some trouble with a particularly stubborn bacterial strain. Perhaps we could discuss it over a cup of tea. I find scientific discussions are always better with tea. The tension in the lobby broke as several people laughed. Here was one of the most brilliant minds in modern medicine, suggesting they tackle a major health crisis over a cup of tea, as if she was simply helping a neighbor with a puzzle. The security badge was ready now, and Officer Chen handed it to Dr. Wu with a slight bow of respect. She clipped it to her simple sweater, the modern plastic badge looking somewhat out of place against the well-worn wall. "Thank you, young man," she said to Chen. "You were quite right to be thorough with security. In fact, I'd like to hear more about your protocols sometime. Security in laboratories has always been a particular interest of mine." Chen straightened with pride, realizing she was treating his job with the same respect she gave to scientific research. It was this quality, her ability to see value in every person's contribution, that had made her such an exceptional leader in her field. As they prepared to head to the research wing, Dr. Wu turned back to the gathered crowd. "You know," she said thoughtfully, "some of my best discoveries came from unexpected moments like this. Sometimes the most important thing is simply being in the right place at the right time, with the right people who are willing to listen." The crowd parted to let her through, many bowing their heads in respect as she passed. Dr. Martinez and Dr. Chang walked beside her, already deep in discussion about the current crisis. Behind them, the crowd slowly dispersed, returning to their regular duties, but now carrying with them the story of how an elderly woman in a simple sweater turned out to be exactly the person they needed, exactly when they needed her. The research lab buzzed with a new kind of energy as Dr. Wu settled into what would become her temporary workspace. The team had quickly cleared a desk for her, positioning it right next to the main microscope station. Someone had found an extra comfortable chair, and another researcher had appeared with a steaming cup of green tea. Word about her tea preference had somehow spread through the building within minutes. First, Dr. Wu said, carefully arranging her notebooks on the desk, "Tell me everything you know about these cases." She pulled out her old-fashioned fountain pen, ready to take notes. The younger researchers exchanged glances. They were used to tablets and digital recordings, but there was something reassuring about her traditional approach. Dr. Martinez began explaining their findings, pointing to the charts and data displayed on the wall-mounted screens. Dr. Wu listened intently, occasionally jotting down notes in her precise handwriting. She didn't interrupt, but her eyes narrowed at certain points, and her pen moved faster during specific parts of the explanation. "Show me the bacterial samples," she said once Martinez finished. The team led her to the advanced microscope setup, but Dr. Wu first reached into her bag and pulled out several sealed containers. "But before that, let me show you what I've been working on in my home lab." The containers held bacterial cultures she'd been growing and studying for the past 3 years. Each was carefully labeled with dates and observations in her neat handwriting. The team gathered around as she began to explain her research. "You see," she said, preparing slides with practiced ease, "we've been thinking about bacterial resistance all wrong. We're so focused on killing the bacteria that we've forgotten to understand them." Her hands moved with the confidence of someone who had performed these actions thousands of times. She worked methodically, setting up parallel slides, one with the hospital's resistant strain and one with her own cultures. "Look here," she said, gesturing to the microscope. "Notice anything unusual about the membrane structure?" One by one, the team members peered through the microscope. Dr. Thompson was the first aghast. "The membrane patterns, they're almost identical to your cultures. But how did you?" Dr. Wu smiled, pulling out one of her notebooks. 3 years ago, I noticed something interesting in my garden. The bacteria in my compost heap were developing unusual resistance patterns, but not in the way we typically see in medical cases. They were adapting, yes, but they were also becoming less aggressive." She flipped through pages of careful observations and detailed drawings. "I started experimenting with different environmental conditions, trying to understand what was driving this behavior. That's when I discovered something fascinating about bacterial membrane properties." The team listened intently as she explained her theory. She used simple analogies, comparing bacterial behavior to human communities, relating complex molecular interactions to everyday situations. Even the youngest lab technicians could follow her reasoning. Instead of trying to break through the bacterial defenses, she explained, sketching a quick diagram on a nearby whiteboard, "What if we could convince them to lower their shields voluntarily?" Dr. Martinez's eyes widened. "Like a peace treaty instead of a war?" "Exactly." Dr. Wu's eyes sparkled with enthusiasm. "These bacteria have developed their resistance because they're fighting for survival. But what if we could create an environment where they don't need to fight? She pulled out more notebooks, spreading them across the lab bench. Years of research conducted in her garage laboratory now laid out before some of the best minds in modern medicine. The team divided up the notebooks, each person taking a section to review. Hours passed in a blur of discussion, experimentation, and discovery. Dr. Wu moved between workstations, guiding different aspects of the research. Her presence seemed to inspire everyone to think differently, to question their assumptions. Young researchers who had been trained on the latest equipment watched in amazement as she demonstrated techniques that had been forgotten in the rush toward automation. She showed them how to observe subtle changes that their machines might miss, how to use their senses as well as their instruments. Sometimes, she said, adjusting a microscope with practiced precision, the old ways and the new ways need to work together. Just like these bacteria, we need to find a balance. The sun had set and risen again, but nobody noticed. They were too engrossed in their work. Dr. Wu had brought a thermos of homemade soup, which she shared with the team during brief breaks. "Can't think properly on an empty stomach," she'd said, pouring out portions into paper cups. By dawn, they had developed a preliminary treatment protocol. It was unlike anything currently in use, a combination of Dr. Wu's insights about bacterial behavior and the team's advanced research techniques. They had created something that worked with the bacteria's natural processes instead of against them. Dr. Thompson was running the final verification tests when she suddenly looked up, her face glowing with excitement. "It's working," she whispered, then louder, "It's actually working." The team crowded around her station, watching as the resistant bacteria responded to their new treatment approach. Dr. Wu stood slightly back, a satisfied smile on her face. She'd seen this moment coming for years, had worked toward it in her quiet garage laboratory while the world thought she'd retired. "Remember," she said softly, "nature always has something to teach us. We just need to be patient enough to learn." Dr. Martinez turned to her, tears in her eyes. "How can we ever thank you?" Dr. Wu patted her hand gently. "Thank me by remembering that breakthroughs can come from anywhere, even from an old woman working in her garage. Now, shall we start preparing this treatment for the patients? We've still got work to do." 3 months had passed since that fateful morning at the security gate. The morning sun streamed through the windows of Stanford Medical Center's main conference room, where a crowd had gathered for what many were calling a historic announcement. The room was packed with medical professionals, researchers, and journalists, all waiting eagerly for the presentation to begin. Dr. Wu sat in the front row, wearing a new sweater her granddaughter had given her, though she insisted on keeping her comfortable old walking shoes. Next to her sat Officer Chen, now dressed in his best uniform. He'd become something of a celebrity himself in the security department, the guard who almost turned away one of medicine's greatest minds. "If you told me 3 months ago that I'd be sitting here today," Chen whispered to Dr. Wu, "I never would have believed it." She patted his hand gently, the same way she had when he'd apologized profusely after her identity was revealed. "You were doing your job," she replied, just as she had then. "Never apologize for being thorough in protecting others." Dr. Martinez stepped up to the podium, her face glowing with pride and excitement. The bacterial outbreak that had threatened to become a major health crisis was now fully contained. All 37 patients had recovered, and the new treatment protocol had been successfully tested in 5 other hospitals. "Today," Martinez began, her voice carrying clearly through the packed room, "we're not just celebrating a medical breakthrough. We're celebrating a reminder that wisdom can come from unexpected places, and that sometimes the best solutions arise when we're willing to look beyond our usual ways of thinking." She went on to explain how Dr. Wu's unique approach, combining traditional observation methods with modern technology, had led to a completely new way of dealing with antibiotic-resistant bacteria. The presentation included slides showing the remarkable recovery rates, but what caught everyone's attention were the before and after stories of the patients who had been saved. There was the young teacher who had been able to return to her classroom, the grandfather who got to meet his newborn grandchild, the chef who was back in his kitchen creating new recipes. Each story drew a quiet smile from Dr. Wu, who had insisted that these human elements be included in what could have been a purely technical presentation. But perhaps the most important outcome, Martinez continued, isn't just the lives we save today. It's the lives we'll save tomorrow, thanks to a new initiative we're announcing, the Margaret Wu Fellowship for Senior Scientists. Dr. Wu looked up in surprise. This was the first she'd heard of it. Martinez went on to explain that Stanford Medical Center had created a special program designed to keep experienced researchers connected to their work after retirement. The fellowship would provide resources and support for senior scientists who wanted to continue their research on their own terms. "We've learned that wisdom doesn't expire with a retirement date," Martinez said, glancing warmly at Dr. Wu. "Sometimes the most innovative thinking comes from those who have the freedom to explore ideas without the pressure of traditional academic constraints." The announcement was met with enthusiastic applause. In the back of the room, several older scientists wiped tears from their eyes. They had been facing their own retirement with dread, worried that their life's work would have to end at an arbitrary date. After the presentation, people lined up to speak with Dr. Wu. Young researchers sought her advice, senior scientists shared their own stories, and hospital administrators from around the country wanted to learn more about implementing similar programs in their institutions. But perhaps the most touching moment came when a group of recovered patients arrived to thank her in person. They had insisted on being there, even though some were still using walking canes or wheelchairs. One young mother held out her baby, born healthy despite her battle with the infection during pregnancy. "May I?" Dr. Wu asked softly, and the mother carefully placed the infant in her arms. The room fell quiet as the elderly scientist who had spent decades studying microscopic organisms now gently cradled its newest beneficiary. "This," Dr. Wu said, looking around at the gathered crowd, "this is why we do our work. Not for papers or recognition, but for moments like these." Later that afternoon, Officer Chen was back at his security desk when Dr. Wu stopped by. She now had a permanent security badge, but she always paused to chat with him. She had even started bringing him tea in the mornings, insisting that security work required a sharp mind and that her special blend of green tea was perfect for maintaining alertness. "You know," she said, pulling a small framed photo from her bag, "I thought you might like to have this." It was a picture taken the day of her discovery, showing Chen standing proudly next to her in the lab. He placed it carefully on his desk, right next to his computer monitor. As the sun set over Stanford Medical Center that evening, the security gate stood as it always had, protecting the important work happening inside. But now it represented something more. A reminder that sometimes the most valuable things in life don't always come in expected packages. And if you visit the hospital today, you might notice something interesting. The security officers now take a moment to chat with every elderly visitor who passes through their gates. "You never know," they say with a smile, when another Dr. Wu might walk through those doors.